to my channel. My name is Nancy, and today our video is about the Payless Murders, which took place back in 1976 in San Mateo, California, and to this day they have yet to be resolved. Let's get right into it. Okay, so just south of San Francisco is a quiet little town called San Mateo, California. It was February 4th, 1979, and a local chain store called PayLess Drug was having their popular Dollar Days promotion. This promotion was pretty popular in San Mateo, so the profits that day were always really high. At closing, PayLess Drug went through its routine closing checklist, which included locking the doors, and then they would have their security guard do a walkthrough of the store to make sure that everyone was gone and they could proceed with the other closing tasks. So registers were emptied and the money was accounted for and deposited into a safe. So on this night, there would be 3 employees closing Payless Drug. So working on this night was 24-year-old Michael Olson. And Michael wasn't even supposed to be there that night. He was nice enough to take over a shift for a co-worker on that day because they had something going on. Michael was a really good employee. He started working at Payless part-time as a box baler and eventually was promoted to merchandising manager. Michael loved his family, and when he wasn't working, he would go out hiking with his wife and their 1-year-old daughter. So also there that night was Tracy Anderson, a 17-year-old student at Hillsdale High School, where he was a junior. Tracy started working at Payless Drug in December of 1978. He was originally hired as a seasonal employee. He ended up being hired after the holiday season as a permanent employee. With Tracy still being in high school, it was mostly just an after-school job that he would use the money from just to save up. When he was not working, he enjoyed working on his car and playing guitar, and he also had a girlfriend that he of course liked to take out. And last but not least, we have 17-year-old William Billy Baumgartner. Going forward, we'll just call him Billy since that's usually what he was called. Billy also started off as a seasonal employee at Payless, eventually being hired on after the holiday season. He was a young but trustworthy employee. He had the responsibility of handling the end of the day accounting, which also included counting money from the registers and depositing the cash and checks into the safe. Billy had recently moved to California with his family from Montana. He was pretty new to the area, so this day was a pretty normal, typical day for Payless Drug. Come 7 p.m., it was time to close down the store. And at about 7:30, after all the registers were emptied, Billy and Michael would head upstairs to the accounting office where they would take care of the day's end accounting and deposit the checks and the cash. While they were upstairs in the office, Tracy stayed downstairs to handle other things that needed to be done, like cleaning and maybe a little bit of stocking up on the shelves. It was not unusual for the third shift employees to arrive a little bit early for their shift and hang out in the parking lot with each other and just chat and catch up. Third shift usually started at 8 p.m. so they would be there shortly before 8 p.m., like 7:45. The nighttime shift was responsible for some more cleaning and restocking the shelves. This night, things were different at Payless Drug. Once it was closer to their start time, the third shift employees would start heading in, but that night when they tried getting into the side door, which is usually where they would go in through, they noticed that it was locked, and when they knocked, no one came to let them in. One of the employees walked over to a nearby payphone. Remember, this is the 70s, there were no cell phones. So he walked over to a nearby payphone and decided that he would call Payless Store to let the crew know that they were outside trying to get into the store, but no one was answering the door. He figured maybe they forgot to unlock the door after they had closed down the store at 7 p.m. and maybe they were just so busy that they couldn't hear their knock. But no one answered the phone. The crew outside didn't really know what to believe, but they knew they had to get inside the store one way or another for their shift. One of the employees ended up calling their manager from a nearby payphone to let them know that no one was opening the door and they needed a way to get into the store. The manager asked that one of them drive up to his house to pick up a spare key to the store. Two employees made the drive out to their manager's house and returned to open the store. Once inside the store, the crew noticed that the lights were still on. Nothing really looked out of place, but there was a deafening silence in the store. You couldn't hear anything. They started making their way through the store and figured they would go upstairs to the office. And to their horror, when they entered the office, on the floor of the office were Michael and Billy in a sea of their own blood. Both had been shot in the back of the head. On the first floor in the stockroom, they found Tracy lying on his back moaning. He had an iron post in his hand that he had used in an attempt to defend himself from the attacker or attackers. The crew ran back outside and immediately called the police. Can you imagine going into work and just finding that grisly scene? Awful. San Mateo police originally thought they were heading to a robbery in progress, but when they arrived at Payless, they realized that the only people inside the building were the victims. Investigators noticed that on one of the doors of the safe, there were two doors on the safe, by the way. It has two compartments, one on top, one on the bottom, and each one had a different combination that was used to open it. One of the doors was still open and there were pennies scattered all over the office floor. When paramedics arrived, they rushed to the aid of the three men. Despite the brutal attacks, Tracy still showed signs of life and he was rushed to a local hospital. One investigator went along in the ambulance with Tracy, hoping that he could give him a name of whoever it was that attacked them. Sadly, Tracy was declared brain dead at the hospital. He passed away at 11:42 p.m. with his family by his side. Paramedics were able to detect a faint heartbeat from Billy. Unfortunately, attempts to save his life failed and he was pronounced dead at the scene at 10:08 p.m. Michael was already dead when the police arrived. Investigators immediately started investigating inside of the store. They could not find any damage to the doors or clues showing a forced entry into the store, even though Payless was already closed for the night. And with the security guard making his walk around the store, he surely would have found someone inside if they weren't supposed to be there. However, it was noticed that a fire door, which is located at the back of the store, had its alarm unplugged. Police speculate that the individual or individuals were hiding inside of the store until it closed and began their attacks after closing time. So the accounting office where Billy and Michael were found was supposed to always be locked. The door had a peephole, which of course would allow someone to look out of the door from the inside. Is it possible that the gunman had a key to the office? How did they make their way in? Maybe he caught Michael and Billy right as they were heading into the office to do the days in accounting and forced his way in with them. Or maybe Michael and Billy opened the door because it was someone they recognized and allowed this person or persons in only to then be attacked by them. But keep in mind, the doors were supposed to be locked because the store was closed for the day. So even if someone was at the door knocking and they looked out the peephole and recognized the individual, there wouldn't really be any reason for them to be inside the store. There were only 3 employees at the store after closing time, and all 3 of them were attacked. Who else would know that Michael and Billy would be doing accounting in the office precisely at this time? Because they unplugged the fire door at the back. So that would have prevented an alarm from going off. So it really started to seem like someone with inside knowledge may have gotten into the store, or better yet, snuck into the store after closing, or they wouldn't have any need to unplug the alarm. It's kind of like, how would they know unless they know? What I gather is that this individual, it may have been individuals, but at least one individual definitely knew the ins and outs of Payless Drug. Ultimately, it was determined that the motive behind the murders was robbery. So the safe, it had 2 compartments, and each compartment had its own combination. Only one of the safe doors was open, and the other was still shut and locked, of course. The robbers took the entire day's profits from the bottom portion of the safe, which amounted to about $18,000 in the 70s. Nowadays, that would be a little over $70,000. And there were also $12,000 in checks. I'm not sure what they would have done with the checks, but they took them with. I'm not even sure that they could cash the checks, but you never know. The money was already inside of bank bags when it was stolen, and those bank bags have never been recovered. Also, the top compartment of the safe was not opened. An argument against it being someone that was familiar with Payless Store because either they worked there or they were an ex-employee or they just had inside information about the store was the fact that they would have known that the combination to the other half of the safe would have been posted on the door that was open. So they would have been able to open the other compartment with that combination being right on the door that was open. But this did not happen. They only took the money from one of the compartments and just didn't do anything with the second one. But then again, maybe they were in a rush. Maybe they knew that they could open the other compartment with the combination that would have been pasted on the other compartment door, but they left the other compartment alone. They didn't take anything from there. It is believed that the reason all 3 men, Michael, Billy, and Tracy, were shot is because they may have recognized the individual or one of the individuals that was there that night committing this crime. And maybe this attacker was worried that they would recognize them, or that they did recognize them, and they would turn him into police. If that was the case though, why would he leave 2 of the victims obviously still alive? Tracy was still moaning when police arrived, and Billy's signs of life should have been obvious. According to the autopsy for Billy survived being shot in the back of the head, but he eventually went into convulsions, which is why there was so much blood on the floor. Billy, Michael, and Tracy were all shot in the back of the head execution style. Based on the trajectory of the shots fired into Tracy, it is believed that he was kneeling when he was shot in the back of the head. Forensic technology was not where it is today back in the 70s. DNA evidence wasn't really a thing back then. Nowadays, scenes like the one at PayLess Store would take days to process. But due to the limited technology back in the 70s, the scene was processed in a sad 5 hours. In addition to it only taking 5 hours for the scene to be processed, it had been contaminated by employees that had gone into the store right before their shift. They couldn't have known what they were walking into, but it did contaminate the scene. They left fingerprints, footprints, unintentionally, but it contaminated the scene. Police did find spent bullet casings, and when they were compared to the victim's gunshot wounds, police concluded that the crime was committed by either a .38 special or a .357 Magnum. Police started questioning the Payless employees, and it was during those interviews that they got their first big break. The security guard that was working that night noticed an employee standing in the stockroom. He remembers thinking that it was strange that he was in the stockroom because he wasn't scheduled to be working that day. Also, he had learned somewhere through the grapevine that this employee had recently purchased a .38 special gun. The employee was George Bandy. So who exactly is George Bandy? George was an Oregon native who had recently moved to San Mateo 2 years prior to the murders. He had moved there with his wife and young children, looking for better work opportunities. Originally, he had gotten a job at Payless as a security guard, but shortly after, he was switched to working in the stockroom. Not long after starting at Payless, him and his wife Rhonda had split up, and she ended up moving back to Oregon with their children. George lived in a small Hayward, California apartment, not too far from Payless Drug. George did admit to police that he was at the Payless store the night of the murders, and the reason he was there is because he had lost a piece of paper with a girl's phone number written on it, and he thought that he may have left that piece of paper inside the pocket of a coat he had left at work. He told police that he arrived 10 to 15 minutes before the store closed. On his way in, he said that he had greeted Tracy. George said that he'd left once the store closed. Right before closing, he made his way out. They asked him about that .38 special gun, and he admitted that he was the owner of a .38 special. Also, he owned a rifle. He agreed to bring his .38 special to police for inspection, but that never ended up happening because George said that he had to give the gun to his wife based on a divorce settlement. In that divorce settlement, she would get the gun. Police wanted to follow up on this with his wife to see if it was true. So police made their way up to Oregon and spoke with Rhonda in an attempt to locate the gun. But according to Rhonda, George had called her the day after the murders and asked her to lie about taking the gun up to Oregon. The truth was, Rhonda never had the gun. George then changed his story and said that he had completely forgotten. He actually tossed the gun into the garbage after shooting a neighbor's dog. Now, about this girl's phone number on that piece of paper he was looking for, apparently her name was Gloria, but after police looked into Gloria and the phone number, they found out that Gloria didn't actually exist. One other thing George had mentioned after leaving Payless store that Sunday night is that he went to a payphone nearby to give Gloria a call, since he had apparently found that piece of paper he was looking for. Police also followed up on this, checking the payphone records, and the AT&T payphone records do not support his claim of having made that call to this so-called Gloria. Just like the gun story and the neighbor's dog being shot by him, and now Gloria, it was all a bunch of lies. George consented to a search of his apartment by the police. When the police searched his apartment, police discovered $500 in $20 bills, but not the $18,000, the checks, or the bank bags. They did also discover a half-used box of ammunition that would fit a .38 special gun, or a 3.57 Magnum, which was the other gun it could have possibly been. They ran some tests on the bullet, but they could not conclusively link this ammunition to the ammunition that was used in the crime. The FBI department was only able to determine that the bullets were consistent with being a match of each other, an exact match of the metal used for the bullets, and the batch number could not be determined. Given how common the .38 special gun was apparently at that time, that type of ammunition was consistent with, but not exactly the hard evidence that police needed to pursue charges against George. George was subjected to intense questioning and he failed 3 polygraph tests. At one point during the interrogation, George broke down crying and went into the fetal position, but police could not get him to admit to having anything to do with the Payless murders. Without a confession or any hard evidence, police could not move forward in pursuing charges against their one and only suspect. George soon hired a prominent defense attorney, James Robert Bob Courchon, and stopped cooperating with detectives when that happened. Without any more big breaks in the case, it seemed that the investigation had stalled. The unsolved status still stands to this day. Following the murders, PayLess Drug offered a $25,000 reward, and they hired their own private investigator to look into the murders. Meanwhile, the San Mateo Police Department investigation remained fully active, but there were so few leads. One promising tip came 6 months later from an Arizona Border Patrol agent. He had stopped a car from re-entering the U.S. from Mexico on suspicions of drugs. No drugs were found during the search, but in the glove box, they did find a whole bunch of clippings about the Payless murders. A San Mateo Police Department officer immediately flew down to Arizona. One of the car's occupants, named Andy T, had fled. The other man, Peter G, was willing to talk to police. According to Pete, Andy was an ex-convict and a heroin addict who had joined a gang called La Familia while in a California prison. At the time of the murders, Andy had found work at Payless in San Mateo as a janitor. After the murders, newspapers had printed that Andy was found inside the store hiding when the murders occurred. After that information was published, Andy said that he was receiving threatening phone calls and he was being followed. Terrified for his safety, Andy asked to be transferred to a different Payless location. Police were able to verify that Andy had in fact worked as a janitor at Payless Drug, but they could not find any evidence linking him to the crime. Andy denied being inside of the store that night. A second tip came from a methadone clinic at San Francisco General Hospital. A witness had overheard a patient saying that they were part of the Payless murders. Police requested a search warrant and seized files from the clinic, but a judge ruled that police must return everything they collected immediately and destroy any information they had collected from the clinic. George Bandy ended up moving to the San Diego area, but he continued to retain Bob Courchon as his attorney. San Mateo Police Department continued to keep tabs on George Bandy. Police are convinced that George Bandy is the killer, but without a confession in their hands were completely tied. San Mateo Police Department decided that the best thing to do was to charge George Bandy with the murder. The fear of facing a death penalty trial might be enough to get George Bandy to talk in exchange for a plea. That month, George Bandy was arrested in Southern California. Despite pressuring George to come clean, George told them that he wanted his attorney there. George was transported back to San Mateo and booked on 3 counts of first-degree homicide with special circumstances and 1 count of robbery. He was held on a $1 million bail. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for February of 1979. It would be up to Assistant District Attorney Clifford Cretan to finally get justice for the victims' families. On February 9, 1981, more than 2 years after the Payless murders, George Bandy would finally face trial in a San Mateo courtroom for his preliminary hearing on 3 counts of homicide, a first-degree homicide with special circumstances, and robbery. Judge Edward Pliska presided over the case. The prosecution had little evidence to present. No confession, no witnesses to the crime, no blood evidence, none of the robbery funds, and no murder weapon. Worse was the explanation for the evidence regarding the bullets that they had found inside of George Bandy's apartment. It was technical, it was confusing. George's attorney, Bob Corshon, argued to the judge that besides the lack of evidence, there were elements of the crime that pointed against it being an inside job. Namely was the $30,000 left in the safe, the other compartment of the safe that was not opened. Then Corshon made a very interesting statement. He said that at best, George Bandy was in some way an accessory after the fact to some crime, but not to the robbery and murders. What crime was Corshon alluding to? What actions had George committed that would make him an accessory? The judge made a swift ruling. Pliska found that there was not enough evidence against George Bandy for a trial and ordered that the charges be dismissed. George Bandy was immediately released, and there has been no one else charged with the crime. Today, the old Payless Drug is now a Rite Aid. It's located on Corkin Drive. The original detectives who worked on the case are now either retired or they have passed away. George Bandy has left the United States and is now located in Mexico, I believe. Police continue to monitor him. In 2007, family members of the victims joined together with the police department in making a public plea for any information. The governor's office contributed $50,000 in reward funds, bringing the total to $75,000 for any information regarding the murders. In 2011, police said that they had a possible break in the case, but they wouldn't release any information on what it is they had gathered. Author John Kreisgall hoped to spark new interest in the case. He released an 8-part podcast series called The Payless Murders, which is super interesting. I listened to all 8 parts. I would highly recommend it. You can find it if you search Payless Murders on Google. Otherwise, I'll add a link here on the screen. The episodes feature extensive interviews, details, and information from the police officers, from family members, and Payless employees. Over the decades, San Mateo has grown, along with the rest of the Bay Valley. It is now a thriving community along the busy 101 corridor between San Francisco and Silicon Valley. One thing has not changed since 1979. They are determined to bring to justice the person or persons responsible for the triple homicide at Payless Drug. There is a $75,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for this horrendous crime. If you have any information, call the San Mateo Police Investigations Unit at 650-522-7650. 650-522-7650. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can. You'll want to call SMPD Anonymous Tip Line at 650-522-7676. 650-522-7676. Or you can even text message an anonymous tip line at 650-262-3473. Or you can email sanmateo@tipnow.org. I'll leave all this information in the description. any information at all, give them a call. May Michael, Billy, and Tracy rest in peace. Thank you for joining me. That's all I have for you today. Take care.